I would like to thank Ned for his speech and call upon Tim to close today's debate.
Got a message from your mum. It's true, he did. Madam Chair, the problem with all of Ned's accusations in this debate was that we did engage with the imperfect reality of the war in Afghanistan. We did engage with the fact that, yes, hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed. But what we told you all along was that reality was necessarily comparative. That reality was comparative with the reality of life under a Taliban regime in which people were dying in the exact same numbers and in many cases in worse numbers. And the reason that comparison was relevant was because without the invasion, we told you the Taliban would still be in power because there was no way for the people in that state to have the military might to overthrow it or even to come up with the populist movements to oppose it, because in doing so they were killed or they weren't granted the education that preceded that populist opposition. We thought that the reality of this debate was a choice between Afghanistan as it is now and Afghanistan as it was under the Taliban and would still be without the invasion. We thought that that was a choice that fell on our side of the House. 3 questions. 1, has the invasion done more harm than good on a humanitarian level? Secondly, what has it done for global security? Thirdly, is the government in Afghanistan stable? First question, has the invasion done more harm than good on a humanitarian level? So both sides agreed that prior to the invasion of Afghanistan, there was a humanitarian crisis. What did the Affirmative tell us in regards to that? They told us that that crisis was not as bad as the results of the invasion, which they told us was hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. The problem with that was that it was incredibly glib about the true nature of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. We told you from the start of this debate that all the civilians were already dying. We pointed to the Taliban's massacres of minority groups like the Hazaris that were already occurring. The people were dying before that. But 2, it wasn't just about, so there weren't civilians to massacre because the civilians never grew up, because there was an infant mortality rate of the World Health Organization estimated to be at about 75%. Ned told us that that figure was made up. And yes, to an extent it was, because the World Health Organization had to make it up because the Taliban refused to keep records on infants who were dying and women who were dying. But more importantly, we gave you reasons as why that was likely to be true. Because the Taliban denied access to healthcare to women and denied access to healthcare to children. Thirdly, we told you that lives weren't the only metric by which you measured a humanitarian crisis. We talked about the denial of rights to things like healthcare, to things like voting, to things like education, to things like the basic freedom of religion that we think that everyone was offered. We thought that those were things that were far worse under a Taliban government than now. What did they tell us in response? They said that these things are still happening now, and they pointed to the fact that there was an acid attack on a woman last year. Firstly, it happens less. Why? Because there are more police and we've trained those police in those areas. 2, there are courts of law that actually function so we can prosecute the people who commit those acts. 3, there was US soldiers on the streets in Afghanistan who could prevent them from happening. 4, there were less Taliban operatives in order to carry out these atrocities, but more importantly, those Taliban operatives were restricted to rural areas, so these attacks weren't happening in the streets of Kabul where the majority of the civilian population lived. But secondly, we thought it was much better under the invasion because we actually found out about those acid attacks, and more importantly, we were able to prosecute the people who committed those acid attacks as opposed to those people being rewarded by the Taliban government that was in place beforehand. So we thought that the humanitarian crisis that preceded the war was far worse than what resulted from it. The second thing they told us is that we've encouraged terrorist attacks against civilians. 1, we told you that those attacks were happening anyway because the Taliban and Al-Qaeda weren't just opposed to the West, they were opposed to the way in which Western values played out in Afghanistan. They were already attacking schools that educated women. They were already attacking hospitals that offered healthcare to women and children. That happened anyway. Their best analysis on this issue is that we abused rights ourselves through things like torture. That came out at second. We agreed that torture wasn't amazing, but this is a case where you have to agree up, you have to go through a way-up process. And we thought that in a state where 75% of people were dying as infants, we thought that we were more important to preference their rights, the rights of those innocent people, than the rights of suspected terrorists who were in much smaller numbers having their rights violated. We thought on a humanitarian grounds alone, the war in Afghanistan has been done far more harm than good. Second question, what's it done for global security? They told us that terrorism is stronger now because because Al-Qaeda has moved to more sympathetic governments and more sympathetic people, like in Pakistan. One, we reject that terrorism is stronger. We've pointed to the fact that there hasn't been an attack on American soil since the war in Afghanistan, the invasion in Afghanistan began. And we told you why that was the case. Because why these groups were moving around like you told us they weren't orchestrating attacks against the rest of the world. But two, if it is true that Pakistan was a more attractive option than Afghanistan because it has nukes and greater sympathy for Al-Qaeda, then Al-Qaeda would go to Pakistan in the first place if it was a more attractive option, because they could get those nukes and get that sympathy from the government and that sympathy from the people. The fact that they didn't mean that state was necessarily less sympathetic, necessarily worse. Three, we told you that we would rather they were operating in at least an allegedly allied state rather than a state that actively opposed us, because it meant that we could gather intelligence more easily. That's why we were able to track down Osama in Pakistan but couldn't track him down in Afghanistan. Fourth, we told you that the invasion has a deterrent effect on these sort of states, because it says that if you harbour terrorists, there is a possibility that your regime will be overthrown. They didn't want to deal with that or respond to it at all. The second piece of analysis they gave us on global security was that terrorism is stronger because it has more support, and this was their hearts and minds analysis. One, we told you why hearts and minds weren't the most important thing in this war. Because we think that even if individuals hate the West, that was meaningless if Taliban and Al-Qaeda couldn't form a meaningful presence, a meaningful physical presence for those people to turn to. So we thought that taking out Al-Qaeda leaders, taking out Taliban operatives, and taking out recruitment officers meant that people weren't, even if they opposed the West, weren't turning to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But two, we told you that all these people hated the West beforehand. Why? Because sanctions were the basic image of the West, but more importantly because the Taliban, whose ideological opposition to the West wasn't just predicated on the Western presence in Afghanistan, they were able to sell that hatred of the West to that population. They were able to force that hatred of the West to the population by gunpoint, and there was no competing narrative offered to those people whatsoever. Hearts and minds were terrible beforehand. Three, we told you what mattered more in terms of combating terrorism was taking away the ability for terrorists to get support from the state. But four, we told you the hearts and minds will improve when those people see the benefits of education and healthcare, which they are being provided now in greater numbers than they were being provided beforehand. The final piece of analysis on this was about political capital. One, it was contingent on them showing that the capital we'd spent on this war was wasted. They never did. Two, they provided us with no alternatives to spend that capital on. We thought that terrorism was far more restricted after the invasion. Third question, what happens to the stability of governance? Both teams agreed that stability was important. What did they tell us? They told us that the government wasn't stable because it built hospitals and those hospitals occasionally got blown up. One, that was devoid of any comparative analysis because under the Taliban there was no hospital beforehand. We'd rather that there were some hospitals and some of them were attacked than there being no healthcare whatsoever. But two, it was far more stable than they ever gave it credit for because they lacked any sort of nuance in understanding the situation in Afghanistan now. So we think that attacks weren't happening across the country. They were restricted and limited to rural areas where there were lower population levels. Kabul, for instance, is quite safe because there is a Western-trained police force to protect it and American soldiers to protect it, which means that women and children could access healthcare and education safely in those areas. Second thing they told us was that the economy would be screwed, has been screwed and will be screwed in the future. One, the economy is better now than it was under the Taliban or would be under the Taliban. And we pointed to evidence of that, the fact that Russians are planning a $300 million deal with the Hamid Karzai government that would not have happened under a Taliban government. Why? We told you that we gave you structural reasons as to why the economy was better. Because firstly, with the Taliban, it was devastated by sanctions. With the Taliban, secondly, Western states were queasy about dealing with it. And thirdly, the Taliban itself didn't encourage any economic activity because it didn't build infrastructure, it didn't build roads, it didn't employ people. Madam Chair, because we thought the invasion did great jobs in solving the humanitarian crisis, because it reduced and restricted terrorists, and because it provided more stability than there would be under the Taliban, we are proud to oppose.
In a close and quality debate leading to a 3-2 split of the panel, the team that will be progressing to the next round is USU 3.
Discussion, debate, democracy. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.